If you grew up in the 90s like me, chances are you remember what we now know as trash TV. You could even argue that some of what we were seeing in the Attitude Era fell under that label, similar to the likes of Jackass and shows like it that followed. There was, however, one undisputed king of trash TV, and that was The Jerry Springer Show. Starting in late 1991 as a fairly earnest and tame-looking talk show that tackled political issues, that would change with the arrival of a new producer in 1994, and his show would make a drastic change, addressing more extreme subjects. Springer would host some of the most bizarre segments ever shown on television, from Klan members debating Jews to a man who married a horse, with much of it feeling less real as the years rolled on. In the words of Jim Cornette talking about the show, when they ran out of real knuckleheads, it became a work. But more on him and Springer a bit later. Before I begin, I'd like to remind you to please consider leaving a comment or even subscribing if you like this video. And please let me know if I missed any wrestlers who appeared on The Jerry Springer Show. Why am I talking about The Jerry Springer Show though? Well, a few months ago, I made a video of every instance I could find of wrestlers appearing on Saturday Night Live, and the passing of Jerry recently made me think of times he hosted wrestlers on his show. Unlike SNL, it's likely impossible for me to find every one here, as for an undetermined period of time, many wrestlers who hadn't yet made it would appear on the show, and a few would be discovered after they were famous. These wrestling personalities would be booked with the help of a wrestler known as Jamie Dundee, who was most famously a member of the team PG-13 in ECW and WWE. He was also an early part of the Nation of Domination, wrapping the group to the ring in his one WrestleMania appearance. He was the son of Memphis wrestling star Bill Dundee, who had a lengthy feud with Jerry Lawler back in the day, and he was also known for being a loose cannon in shoot interviews. So all that said, I'm going to show you some of the more notable appearances that I found, and one that nearly happened. And where better to start than the bad guy. On an episode that aired on January 17th, 1996, Springer welcomed 11-year-old Hydea and her friend Tyler, who were both diagnosed with AIDS at a very young age. The two had been on the show 2 years earlier, and had married each other in a friendship ceremony, whatever that means exactly. According to Tyler years later, the producer had asked them both who their heroes were, and he had mentioned WWE star Razor Ramon, but he had no idea that they would get to meet him until he showed up on the stage. If you know Springer for the wild brawls that would take place on almost every episode, you'd be forgiven for expecting the worst from this segment as the bad guy walks out, but it actually was as wholesome as it could possibly have been. Razor would invite the two to WrestleMania 12 and hand his Intercontinental title belt to Tyler, who claimed to still have the belt in a 2016 interview with WWE. Rumour has it that Razor gave them the belt on the spur of the moment without checking with WWE, who weren't happy when they had to get a new belt made. Hydea in the same WWE interview years later said of Razor, even though he had the bad guy persona at the time, he was really cool and awesome. He really seemed to care about us and wanted to make us happy. She went on to talk about how good it felt for her to have such a public figure show her such support. It's not clear what Tyler went on to do with his life, though as of the WWE interview he had a family of his own who have grown up HIV negative. Hydea is more of a public figure, as she has since childhood continued to be an advocate for spreading awareness about the disease. Brace yourselves for a gear change now, because it's time to talk about Jim Cornette again. In the segment from his podcast 3 years ago, Cornette noted that one time he was close to going on the Springer Show, but it never actually happened. For a bit of context before I go in the mid-90s, when Cornette was booking Smoky Mountain Wrestling, he hired a team known as the Gangsters, Mustafa and New Jack. If you don't know much about New Jack, I strongly recommend you go and watch his Dark Side of the Ring episode, after this of course, as he goes into detail about his time working for Cornette. There isn't really a way to sugarcoat this, but the Gangsters, New Jack in particular, would take full advantage of being black heel wrestlers being booked in the South in the early 90s. New Jack would fully play up to this in promos, going as far as to incite hatred from the fans. He would even go as far as to refer to real-life news stories, such as a horrendous line relating to O.J. Simpson that I'm not even sure I can repeat on YouTube. A fan had questioned Cornette, as it had been reported by Dave Meltzer in April 1995 that a segment was supposed to be taped on the Jerry Springer Show but had been scrapped. In the following issue, Dave went into more detail, claiming that WWE had blocked the appearance because in the other 49 states that don't have access to Smoky Mountain Wrestling, Cornette at the time was a WWE personality, and so they wanted to avoid any controversy. Cornette's immediate retort was that it was actually 47 other states, which makes it so much better. Jim claims that someone on the show had contacted them, having seen the ongoing storyline, and Cornette accepted based on getting a bit of exposure for SMW and a payday for the wrestlers involved. He goes on to say that word got back to Vince through The Undertaker, who worked occasional SMW dates. While I'm on the subject, it was during this time where Undertaker was doing dates in Smoky Mountain that he would encounter a young wrestler called Unabomber. He would then recommend this wrestler to Vince McMahon. The man in question would be Glenn Jacobs, who would go on to be Kane. He'd be a dentist first, but then he'd go on to be Kane. Cornette would claim that he received a phone call from Vince McMahon himself, who would perform what Cornette called a Jedi mind trick, talking Cornette out of doing the Springer Show. He then goes on to note that at the time he was still managing Owen Hart and the British Bulldog in WWE, who were also sending talent to Smoky Mountain for his bigger shows. So it really comes down to Cornette weighing his options up and not wanting to wreck his long-term relationship with WWE over a short-term payoff. And I can't really blame him for that. From here, things will only get stranger in this next segment from 1999, titled Amazing Tales. It begins with a woman having a confession to make to her partner, as these segments often started. The man in the segment being a wrestler known as Anthony Durante, or Pitbull No. 2 in ECW. But he's not the only wrestler involved. The woman admits to finding a new man, and out walks, of all people, the Iron Sheik. Pitbull falls out of his chair, and frankly, I nearly did too. If you know anything about the Iron Sheik these days, you know he can barely go a few sentences without bashing Hulk Hogan, Bubba, and it takes him about 10 seconds until he does it here. The segment doesn't end with the traditional Jerry Springer brawl, however it does end with Pitbull worryingly pulling a woman out of the crowd to prove that finding someone new wouldn't take long. Television in the 90s was very different. The next entry is going to be a quick one, and wasn't technically on the Jerry Springer Show. Jerry was at one point so popular that he once made a cameo on a show called SMTV Live, a British Saturday morning kids show from the late 90s, hosted by Anton Deck, who simply won't go away. He took part in a sketch called Chums, which was a rubbish parody of Friends, and I'm really starting to feel old now. Jerry's security in the skit, bizarrely, was of all people, Kurt Angle. Kurt even laughed about this on his Instagram when people found the clip a year ago. Before we leave the 90s, I guess we have to briefly talk about Vince Russo, who has gone on record multiple times of saying that he and Ed Ferrara would watch Jerry Springer while writing Raw to get ideas. This makes total sense when you look at all the shows Vince is credited, and I use that word very loosely, as writing. Especially his initial run of WCW shows, which I'll go in depth on this channel eventually, just for their insanity. Even in his TNA writing days, he would never really evolve past that late 90s trash TV style, peaking in a 32-man brawl in several locations all at once at the Impact Zone, which Cornette, who was a producer for TNA at the time, had described as a logistical nightmare. I'm going to end this video with two non-wrestlers who are currently employed by AEW, as both Justin Roberts and Alex Abrahantes both appeared on Springer in the 2000s. By this time, Springer's show had fallen into a pretty basic formula, where every segment would erupt into a pro wrestling style brawl. In Roberts' episode, he played a man called Joe, who was on the show to be told that his girlfriend had been sleeping with her own sister. Many years later, in an interview while still in WWE, Justin would explain that he was 19 and in college at the time, and was recommended to the show's producers by a New York wrestler called Big Daddy. Not that one. Justin said he took the gig as it would allow him a free trip home to Chicago, where he's from, and also where the Springer show is taped. He then goes on to explain in great detail how the story was entirely fictional, and how the way it was produced reminded him of how wrestling's produced. In Abrahante's case, he was on the show as Alan, there to find out that he was being cheated on. As far as I'm aware, Alex has never commented on this publicly, but here's a trivia note for you. On the January 25th, 2001 episode of SmackDown, clips of both Alex and Justin Roberts are shown auditioning for the first season of Tough Enough. I wondered how I was going to end this video, but it has to be with a Jerry Springer inspired final thought. Are you ready? Thank you for watching yet another wrestling channel. If you enjoyed this, please comment, like or subscribe.